I recognize the honourable member for North Coast.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. It's very interesting that in that elaborate and dramatic speech from the Transportation Minister that he not once mentioned BC ferries in his speech. I'd like to start out by just acknowledging that it's been a wonderful almost 4 years being the MLA for North Coast and representing the many communities that make up my riding. It's been a challenge, and it's been an honor, and it's been so rewarding. Honourable Speaker, I'd like to talk about the budget, the forget everything budget. This government wants us to forget, well, their track record for the last 16 years. They want you to forget that this Premier has been working at the top while making life worse for ordinary families. She wants families to forget that her government doubled MSP premiums. Only now, in the lead up to this election, she's saying that, oh, we're going to undo all that. She wants people to forget that their hydro bills and their car insurance are still going up. Housing costs, forget about our housing costs that are skyrocketing, that there's a crisis in childcare affordability, and forget that BC has the worst wage growth in Canada. She wants the people of Bella Coola and the Central Coast to forget that they cancelled their ferry and they starved out coastal communities. The Premier wants the municipality of Prince Rupert to forget that while they're facing over $300 million in infrastructure deficits, including threats to our water supply, that they are not included in any of these LNG funding agreements. Nothing to buffer any increase in pressure from the industry that would bring to our community. Is it because they actually don't think the industry will come to fruition? She wants you to forget that families are paying $1,000 a year more for just hydro, car insurance, and MSP premiums since she became Premier. She wants people to forget that she took a second salary of $300,000 from her wealthy friends and gave a $1 billion tax break to the top 2% of income earners. The only thing this Premier cares about is winning the next election. After years of neglect, why would anyone believe that she's going to change now? Honourable Speaker, there's nothing in this budget for senior citizens. Nothing in the forget everything budget. 91% of publicly funded residential care homes fail to meet the minimum staffing benchmarks. Last year, it was 88%, and that was atrocious then. Now it's worse. We have the second worst wait list for hip and knee replacement surgeries in Canada. Nothing for knees and hips in this forget everything budget. More concerning is the lack of specific mention of long-term fixes to problems with surgery wait times, which for hip and knee replacements, like I said, are second worst. In a pre-election budget, the lack of specifics of these funding increases, the increase to the health budget represents 78% of the increases to the overall provincial budget. I'm guessing we'll see a number of announcements in the coming weeks while the government parcels out spending increases for political gain, those for their choosing, because why would we mention it in the budget? It's worth pointing out that the word senior doesn't even appear in the budget speech, nor does the word surgery. The Premier is now also saying she will fix mental health and addictions, and her and her team have neglected for a greater part of a decade. Weeks ahead of a provincial election, she's now going to fix it. And 7 years into the BC Liberals' 10-year mental health and addiction plan for the province, a plan which has left children and adults struggling with debilitating addictions and mental health problems without the immediate access to treatment that they need. People have suffered, and now it's election time, and oops, we suddenly care about people with mental health and addictions. I don't think many people are going to forget that despite many warnings, this government was very slow to react to the fentanyl overdose crises. And And going back to the residential care standards, Honourable Speaker, the minimum staffing requirement of 3.36 hours per resident per day dropped from an already low 18% in 2016 to a paltry 9% in 2017. Despite that, there's no mention in the budget for new funding or programs to address our seniors in long-term care facilities. In Acropolis Manor in Prince Rupert, Honourable Speaker, the staff are burned out. Residents are waiting hours to be toileted. The seniors that built this province are being woken up early in the morning, sitting there waiting for hours before breakfast because there's not enough time for the care aides to help them with their activities of daily living. Seniors are most likely to be impacted by the long wait lists for hip and knee replacements and for cataract surgeries, each of which is the second worst in Canada for their categories. There is no specific mention of measures to address these shortfalls in this forget everything budget. A recent study by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives showed that there is available capacity at existing operating rooms in BC, 18% of operating rooms in BC's public hospitals are not regularly staffed, and none of them have extended hours. Let's talk about the MSP. It's only a promise. The Premier wants people to forget that she and her government have more than doubled the MSP premium since 2001. Doubled it. Also, this won't be implemented until after the election. And after all the broken promises, why would anyone believe the BC Liberals now? BC renters are facing a housing affordability crisis, but this budget doesn't offer any help. In fact, this government is cutting funding to the residential tenancy branch by 2%, at a time in my area where rent evictions and other tenant issues are skyrocketing and people desperately need help. Justice Services received a modest increase in this budget, but there's no concerted effort to address the ongoing staff shortages and safety issues in corrections and sheriff services. The Liberals refuse to invest in the legal aid system they decimated over a decade ago, or to properly resource the courts and Crown Prosecution Service to protect against the staying of criminal cases. Debt. Debt is going way up. The total debt is forecast to go up by $11 billion over the 3-year fiscal plan, from $66.7 billion as of March 31st, 2017, to $77.7 billion as of March 31st, 2020. Total government debt has doubled under the BC Liberals. It rose by $32.9 billion between 2001 and 2017. In her 6 years as Premier, the Premier has added $21.5 billion to the debt, the biggest increase in BC's history. And this is the government that prides itself on its fiscal record. Cuts to treaty funding. Budget 2017 cuts funding to treaty by 2%. This funding cut, together with the Premier undermining the treaty process altogether and refusing to appoint a chief treaty commissioner for nearly 2 years now, shows this government isn't working for First Nations engaged in the treaty process. MCFD, the Ministry of Children and Families. After ignoring child and youth mental health services for years, for example, only 0.2% of an increase in last year's budget to MCFD, the government is investing $45 million now. That's a 20% increase in this budget. The pre-election budget, the forget everything budget. The increase should not make people forget the damage done by years of government neglect. People will not forget the children that have been seriously injured or who have died because of the shortage of frontline social workers in the Ministry of Children and Families. In childcare, a one-time $20 million earmark will go to help childcare providers expand their spaces. The government says this will create up to 2,000 new childcare spaces. While BC has the second most expensive childcare in the country, this will do nothing for affordability. This measure is only in response to our plan, the NDP's plan for a universal $10 a day childcare. Small business tax cuts. The BC Liberals are reducing the small business tax from 2.5% to 2%, effective April 1st.
Where's the money for the debt coming from?
Note, Honourable Speaker, that is well short of what they promised in the 2013 election, which was, quote, lowering the small business tax rate.
Members, order in the House. Continue.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Note, Honourable Speaker, that this is well short of what they promised in the 2013 election, which was, quote, lowering the small business tax rate from 2.5% to 1.5% no later than the 2017-2018 fiscal year, with at least a 0.5% reduction in 2015-2016. Not only did they do nothing last year in the 2015-2016 fiscal budget, they have not reached the promised 1.5% rate that they promised in the last election. Another example that proves you can't believe anything this Premier says, anything that she promises. The elimination of the so-called direct operating debt will be slower because of this budget. As recently as September 2016, they were saying it would be gone by 2019-2020. But that has been pushed back 1 year to 2020-2021. The direct operating debt is the measure of the government uses to try to get us to forget about their, quote, debt-free BC. Remember the debt-free BC bus that toured around the province? In the last election, they were telling us that BC would be debt-free within 15 years. But in the last 4 years, the total debt has gone up by $10.9 billion. But the difference between direct operating debt, taxpayer-supported debt, and Crown Corporation self-supported debt is somewhat arbitrary. Direct operating debt is vilified because it is incurred as a result of government maintaining social programming such as healthcare and education during economic downturns, whereas capital-related and Crown Corporation debt has been incurred for such projects as the Northwest Transmission Line, the Vancouver Convention Centre, the Port Mann Bridge, countless IT boondoggles, the Site C Dam for the energy we don't need, and so on. After 15 years of cuts and underfunding BC's public education system, the Budget 2015 finally provides desperately needed funding, but only because the Supreme Court of Canada forced the Premier to do so. We only need to look at Budget 2016 to see what this government really had planned for BC's kids and classrooms. For instance, Budget 2017 boosts public school funding to $5.4 billion for the next 3 years, while Budget 2016 planned to keep it flat at $4.7 billion. Furthermore, most budget areas do receive a funding boost in 2017, but this either flattens out or decreases in 2018 and 2019. Lastly, Budget 2017 sets out $320 million over 3 years to fund the agreement with the BC Teachers Federation, but doesn't include figures for the costs of the final settlement. The government says they plan to invest $2 billion over the next 3 years to maintain, replace, renovate, or expand K-12 facilities. This figure includes seismic upgrading and replacing of schools. The budget fails to mention that 35% of BC schools are still waiting for seismic upgrades, including schools like the Prince Rupert Middle School, which is sinking because it sits on a former garbage dump site, a landfill. In the environment, there's a lot of new funding for the environment in the Forget Everything Budget 2017, most of which is welcome news, but it comes after those very same programs were cut drastically by this government over the last 16 years. Cuts include, in 2009, the government made a huge 40% cut to BC Parks auxiliary staff. During the same time period, the contingent of regular staff legally designated as park rangers had also been eroded from 88 positions in 2008 to 77 in 2016, a further 11.4% reduction in staff. Between 2008 and 2016, the number of full-time park rangers went from 10 to 7, a 30% reduction. The staff cuts outlined above are in addition to cuts made to BC park staff before 2008. Honourable Speaker, there's still a lot of unaddressed environmental issues, such as the village site of Namu on the Central Coast in the territory of the Helsik First Nations. It's a rapidly decaying old cannery falling into the ocean. The Premier, let's not forget, and I don't think the people of Bella Bella will forget, that the Premier comes to visit when royalty's in town, but fails to even pick up the phone when a major oil spill is happening in the Helsik territory, contaminating their clam beds and their food sources. Not a phone call, not a visit then. I don't think the people of Bella Bella will forget. Honourable Speaker, LNG is barely mentioned in Budget 2017. It's on page 50, but it wasn't even included in the budget speech. And the Prosperity Fund, even less so. There's no revenue shown from LNG. No revenue. No revenue added to the Prosperity Fund from LNG. Is this Premier hoping that British Columbians will just forget her 2013 election promises? Honourable Speaker, let's not forget that Prosperity Fund. The broken promises on the Prosperity Fund include that it would contribute to making BC a debt-free. In fact, under this government, British Columbians' public debt has increased 45%. The largest increase under any one Premier in BC's history. Let's not forget that the Prosperity Fund included $100 billion. $100 billion would flow directly into the Prosperity Fund. In fact, the Premier has taken $400 million from MSP premiums that she took from average working people and put it into her Prosperity Fund and her real estate. Don't forget her real estate market to create a pre-election slush fund. That Prosperity Fund could eliminate the sales tax. That was another promise. In fact, the government took $6.5 billion from PST this year. Don't forget that she said the Prosperity Fund will accelerate the paydown of BC Hydro and for the Port Mann Bridge. In fact, BC Hydro's debt has grown from $11.7 billion to $19.5 billion under this government. The BC government, you know, they've significantly scaled back their LNG expectations. They want us to forget that the Premier promised 100,000 jobs from LNG and a plant up and running by 2015 and 5 by 2020. The Premier promised a $100 billion prosperity fund from LNG revenues. This Premier and this government wants us to forget that LNG was to eliminate our debt, eliminate the PST, and create 100,000 jobs and $1 trillion in economic activity. In 2014, LNG was a chance, not a windfall. In 2015, LNG was still a generational opportunity, but barely mentioned otherwise in an effort to change the channel. In 2016, the BC Liberals finally admitted their timelines would not be met. But they whined, the government's done all that they can, that global conditions are posing new challenges, and the Premier touted that success is not for quitters. And this year, its LNG needs global markets to thrive, and unforeseen headwinds have created challenging conditions, and reminding us that world markets may go up and down, and the very best that they can do is insist that bringing home the generational opportunity of LNG remains within reach. Does this government honestly think that people in my riding will forget the promises this Premier made in regards to LNG? Does she honestly think the businesses that started or the small businesses that hung on by a thread hoping for the LNG windfall she promised are going to forget? Does she think that the people in my riding who actually had concerns about the siting of one LNG project were labeled a ragtag group of people? Real people with reasonable concerns labeled a ragtag group of people. These were hereditary and elected chiefs and matriarchs and citizens. Let's talk about housing. Aside from making a small change to the property transfer tax, the exemption threshold, the Premier's government didn't announce anything new for affordable housing in this Forget Everything budget. Their desperate attempts to convince people that they care about affordability after ignoring the housing crisis for years were all announced prior to this election. BC Housing is in the process of selling off all its social housing projects and in Forget Everything Budget 2017, they expect to generate a total of $344 million in revenue by 2020. The only new housing measure in Budget 2017 is an increase to the property tax threshold for the first-time homebuyers exemption. Forget Everything Budget 2017 rolls the Premier's housing announcement together by saying this government committed $855 million for the construction of 4,900 units of affordable housing across the province. In reality, much of this funding is spread out over 5 years. Many of the units won't be new, but rather renovated, and the earliest new housing projects won't be ready till 2018. Too late for the people most hurt by this housing crisis that we're in right now. And I will acknowledge that recently, as part of some LNG agreements, that we're going to see some housing in the Northwest. New seniors housing in Port Edward, and 2 local First Nations will see provincial funding for housing. But I remind this government that this is only the tip of the iceberg in addressing the Northwest's housing needs. I would like to outline some of these issues. It's unfortunate that the Minister of Housing has just left the House, because I would like to outline the issues in a letter I wrote to him.
Member, the absentee of any member should not be mentioned in the House.
My apologies, Honourable Speaker. I'd like to outline some issues in a letter I wrote to the Housing Minister 7 months ago that I have yet to receive a response from. Dear Minister, I'm writing today to outline a variety of the housing issues that residents in Prince Rupert are currently facing. My constituency office continues to see an increase in the number of requests for assistance in finding affordable and appropriate housing in Prince Rupert. Service providers in Prince Rupert also report an increased demand for housing support services. With the province's financial update indicating a significant surplus, my recommendation is to immediately invest in Prince Rupert's housing infrastructure. Although the much-promised LNG industry has yet to result in a single project coming to fruition, rampant speculation has created dramatic changes in the local real estate market. Unprecedented pressure has been put on the limited rental housing sector, resulting in people being put out on the street, especially those who have limited or are on fixed incomes. Prince Rupert has some of the oldest housing stock in the province. We have a large quantity of wartime homes, which used to be affordable homes for renters. Currently, I'm witnessing a trend where longtime tenants in these homes are being rent-evicted, with the homes being subsequently rented out at much higher rates, well beyond the reach of the previous renters. The average age of homes in Prince Rupert, compared to the rest of the province, is significantly older. Approximately 24% of the housing stock in Prince Rupert was built prior to 1945, with 6% of that being built prior to 1920. Compared to the rest of the province, where only 14% of the housing stock was built prior to 1945, and less than 2% of the housing stock was built before 1920. We have seen minimal new builds in the last few decades, and with almost half of the housing stock being a half a century old or older, the options for safe, affordable, and appropriate housing are limited. The majority of social housing stock in Prince Rupert is in a state of disrepair. In a coastal temperate rainforest with some of the highest amounts of precipitation in North America, housing maintenance is an ongoing challenge. Chronic mold and rot from the relentless damp climate are just some of the problems faced by all homeowners, as well as property managers, including those of the Macola Housing Society, who are now responsible for managing BC housing properties. Many social housing units are uninhabitable and sit vacant. The housing replenishment regime is inadequate and lacks sufficient funding. Service providers are unable to afford the much-needed upgrades and improvements required to properly maintain properties to a habitable state. Additionally, this spring, I tested selected BC housing units for lead in their water pipes and discovered elevated lead levels in the drinking water. As a result, a whole section of BC housing units in Prince Rupert are currently on a water flushing regime. My constituency office, social service providers, and poverty advocates in Prince Rupert are reporting an increase in requests for assistance with regards to tenants being rent-evicted or evicted for other illegal reasons. One service provider in particular reports a noticeable difference between 2015 and 2016 with regards to the number of clients who are homeless and/or who have been evicted. Local service providers and the resources available to them are being stretched to the limit while they attempt to find housing solutions for people in need. In 2015, an entire community of mobile homeowners and renters were evicted from the Port Edward Trailer Park because a speculator purchased the property in order to capitalize on a potential LNG boom. The initial plan was to develop housing for LNG workers at the expense of these local tenants. All the tenants have left or have been removed. Some have gone to homeless shelters in other communities, others are couch surfing, and yet the property sits undeveloped. There are little to no options for single occupants on social assistance. The shelter amounts provided by the Ministry of Social Innovation and Social Development are not sufficient to allow people to afford the rental rates in Prince Rupert. Aside from the prices, the availability of single occupant rental units is extremely limited. In 2004, 100 low-rent apartments were lost to a fire and were never replaced. While the available housing stock has shrunk significantly over the years, the waitlist for low-rent and subsidized single units grows each year. There is a lack of seniors housing and wheelchair-accessible units in Prince Rupert. Many seniors and persons with disabilities are living in unsafe conditions while they wait for appropriate units to become available. Many of these individuals are waiting in earnest for units that seldom become available, and often they give up before finding appropriate housing. There is no men's shelter in Prince Rupert, which has long been identified as a need in this community. The pseudo-homeless shelter that does operate it is limited to just 8 beds and faces ongoing issues of bed bugs and violence among tenants, such that individuals avoid sleeping there. The North Coast Transition Society operates a transition home for women fleeing abuse. However, it has become a de facto homeless shelter for women and their children. The Transition House operates 20 short-term beds, and they turn women away every day due to overcapacity. The housing squeeze has been steadily tightening over recent years. However, it's been further exacerbated and accelerated by the speculation resulting from the anticipated but not yet realized LNG industry. Market rental rates are now at Vancouver prices, but Prince Rupert still lacks the services, amenities, and availability found in the Lower Mainland. The housing challenges in Prince Rupert are impacting families, single people, working professionals, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal citizens, seniors, persons living with disabilities. Essentially every demographic of our population has been affected one way or another by a declining housing inventory and declining investment. The issues I outlined above are just a brief summary of the housing issues facing the people of Prince Rupert and the surrounding communities. These issues are varied and diverse, therefore solutions must be as well. I draw your attention to these challenges and urgently request that you consider the needs of Prince Rupert citizens for affordable housing and housing supports. I look forward to your prompt response and to working with you to address the escalating problems facing Prince Rupert and other Northwest communities. BC renters are facing affordability crises, Honourable Speaker, and this budget doesn't offer any help for that. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll just conclude with, I believe that after years of neglect, the recent random acts of funding displayed by this government is an attempt to make British Columbians forget everything. They want people to forget that for the last 16 years, this government has dipped into the pockets of working and middle-income people while they gave their millionaire friends a tax break. Honourable Speaker, there is a clear choice between a government that works for ordinary people and a government that works for the wealthy and the well-connected. Thank you.